we go. 5, 4, 3. All right, we should be live here on the live stream with Koen Heldens. Thank you guys so much for joining us for the premiere of Koen's Mixing Masterclass here at MixCon 2021. Great to have you guys with us. Koen, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for being part of MixCon this year.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. It was fun to do.
Killer, man. You did a great presentation. We got a ton of questions already coming from the audience, and I've got a few of my own. Before we get into them, I just want to give a quick shout out to Sonarworks, makers of Sound ID Reference. Koen's been using their stuff, I think, for years now. How long have you been a Sonarworks user?
Yeah, even before they rebranded it to Sound ID. Because I used to use it back in the day on my other monitoring system. So before, you had the room tune and the speakers are tuned to the room and everything, I was using them because it was easier, especially with home studios, to just put the mic up, shoot it out, and get a flat as possible frequency response. So it's amazing. And nowadays, headphones, whenever I have like that double thing that I can check where I'm totally sure, like, okay, this is what it is. So when I listen in the room and I'll be like in a different room, I'll be like, okay, I kind of have a feel of how this room sounds and kind of see what the, what the nodes are that I need to take care of as far as like when I mix, that I don't like adjust those. And then, I just put on the headphones and be like, okay, yep, I'm doing this right. This is translatable. So yeah, I've been using it for years.
All right. So we have a lot of questions coming in for you. And before I do, just want to verify with you, we have you booked. Is it half an hour okay? You good to go to about 3:30 Eastern? Is that okay for you?
Totally, yes.
All right, good stuff. All right, I see more questions coming in. And another quick question for you around monitoring. Do you still work with headphones? So I know you do a lot of headphone mixing when you're not in a studio. For a while, I don't know if everyone knows this story, but you were basically trapped in the Netherlands, although you had a studio and a home in America. Right at the beginning, right before COVID started, you said, oh, it'd be nice to take a trip to the Netherlands. And then you couldn't get back to the US for like a year, even though you're like a homeowner and studio owner out here. So you were doing a lot of headphone mixing out there. I'm curious, A, have you done a lot of headphone mixing before that happened? And B, when you're in studios, like nice studios now, do you still use headphones as an important check for what you do?
So yes, it's an interesting situation how that happened. And then I never really used to check anything. Well, not really. I never used to check on headphones to begin with. Because also I wasn't using software that would enable me to listen through headphones without hearing the headphones, if that makes any sense. So it was never like a flat frequency response. You always had to learn the headphones as much as you had to learn the speakers. So having said that, this was my first experience during the pandemic to really have to rely on headphones. And now still, if I go to studios, like I just explained, even if I know the studio, I'm still going to use my headphones every once in a while to double check if I'm on point, that I know that, okay, this is going to translate correctly versus, oh, there's some, notes in the low end or the mid range whereby now it sounds great in the room, but as soon as I play it somewhere else, it might be too muddy or it might be too light, thin of a mix. So yes, even now I still use the headphones as like a cross reference to make absolutely sure that whatever I'm mixing is going to translate.
Right, very cool. Makes sense. I've been using headphones too as part of mastering checks for a while now, which is something I never thought I'd be able to do. But having listened to every master I've done, not only on my speakers, but on my headphones as well, I now feel confident, to make mix revisions and stuff on the road with them. And for those of you who notice this is not my usual backdrop, I'm on the road right now. I'm in Cape Cod, Massachusetts on vacation. So you have to excuse my unshaven appearance. And although you're rocking it well. I've got to say, you got trimmed in the right places, full in the right places. I'm digging it, dapper. But me, I'm just full vacation dad. Like I haven't bothered.
You should be.
So that's my backdrop for anyone who wants to know. Now, question for you, moving on from monitoring, Koen. One of the questions that came in a lot after the end of the presentation was, what does your master bus chain look like? That was the one thing you didn't touch in your main masterclass. The people want to know, is there any secret sauce happening? Are you big into mixing through compression and bus processing? Is it something you leave off? Can you give us a little idea about your strategy and approach there?
It's super simple. It's just the SSL bus compressor,
Hmm.
and then I have two limiters on there. Maybe every once in a while I might put a EQ on there to either roll off some of the low lows, because it's basically just air that you don't want to have to, make the speakers move too much so they break, or have the, trouble of breaking them. So that it keeps it more controlled. Or where I'm like, oh, I might want to give it a little bit more shininess, or I've mixed it slightly too bright where I can kind of dim it down in general.
Right.
And it's literally like I either use the Fab filter, the Pro L,
Hmm.
or the isotope maximizer, or the combination of both. Where I'm like, I rather do it in series than one main limiter, because we all know if one limiter is taking off like 5-6 dB, especially you in mastering know that for sure, Justin, it does way too much work, and it creates so many artifacts. Whereby as you use it in series and each one takes off about 2 dB, it is a much cleaner signal and much louder as well. You can go louder. So that's basically just my master chain. It's nothing, nothing really, happening there. Because at the end of the day, I think you can alliterate the two, where it's like a good mix. Well, it starts with the production and recording. When those are done really well and good, and the mix is done really good, then it's an easier job also in mastering, and you don't really have to do much. And
Hmm.
that's the same, approach that I have. Like I said in the beginning of this, the seminar, where I'm like, everything for me is gain staging. That's why the WML meter from Waves is sitting continuously on my screen as well, because I want to know that if I steer it into my mix bus, that I'm hitting about -8 on my LUFS long term,
Hmm.
-7 on the short term, which is already incredibly loud. Don't get me.
Yes.
And then by the end of the mix, it's reading -7 on the long term and -6 on the short term, which is
Hmm.
even louder. The reason
Hmm.
why that is sitting there is I can watch my gain staging. So let's say if I'm in the middle of the mix and I'm already starting to hit -7, -6 on the long term, I know that my mix is way too hot, so I can pull it
Hmm.
back. Versus not paying attention to the meter, and then once you're at the end of the mix, it's completely crushed and slammed against the wall, where you're like, okay, now I have to do so much backtracking. So that way I can easily see like, okay, I'm still doing right as far as the numbers go. Of course, you have to listen, because sometimes even with those numbers, it's still smashed against the wall. You have to figure out, okay, I have to back off on
Yeah.
whatever I'm doing. So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And that you already knocked out one of our first questions that came in, which was, why is that meter there? Is that really helping you? And I think you've answered that pretty well. Question so that they listeners understand better. Is your final mix that loud? So you're talking about levels that could be considered like final master levels. Is that the final level of the mix that you're sending out? Are you one of the guys who's like, I'm going to send it to a mastering engineer at pretty much the level it needs to be and it's done? Or is some of that just reference limiting? Or are you saying I'm mixing through the limiter, so I'm going to keep it there because that's part of the sound of the mix?
It's the latter. It's I used to send it to mastering without the limiters on there.
Right.
And then we started getting the issues of, it started sounding slightly different,
Yeah.
and the artist started having issues with that, where I started being like, okay, why go that route that the mastering engineer has to reinvent the wheel that we
Mm-hmm.
already created? Why don't I back off on the output ceiling to make sure that there's at least, about a dB or more of headroom still left for the mastering engineer to do what he needs to be doing,
Yeah.
versus having, sending the files, for instance, to you, and you're going to put a limiter on there anyway,
Right.
you then have to reinvent what it is. Or in some cases, it's even the case where I'm like, okay, I can send it without the limiters, and they're like, well, we have the same plugins. Why don't you send the screenshots of what you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's also instances where you can say like, hey, I actually have a better way of doing this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, by all means. So this is what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and do you, and shine the way you do as I do in mixing. So
Right.
yeah, I send it out with the limiters on.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that. I feel like if you're going to be mixing through the limiters and that's part of the process, it's like that's part of the sound of the mix. Send it to me. And there are those mixes I get where it's like, my job isn't to make it any louder. Like that's already taken care of. My job is to double check brightness, uh, amount of low end with, amount of mid range against records that they really want this to shine next to. And I'm not making it louder at all. Or my job is they did a whole album and now I'm double checking the level from one track against another, or the amount of low end from one track against another. So there are those masters where it's like, it's not my job to make this louder. They mixed it loud. And I'm a total big believer in that. If you're going to be mixing through your limiters, why take them off at the end? But it is a little bit of an advanced technique where I don't recommend people starting mixing like in their first, like, I'm in my first month mixing. Should I mix through 2 limiters and try to get to -7? Probably not. But as you get experience and confidence, and you feel like you can hear what the limiter is doing, then by all means, you start working up to it.
It took me years too, sorry to interject, it took me years too to hear compression. And then
Yeah,
now
of
I
course.
can really start hearing compression where like, it's just grabbing too hard on it. And people are like, I don't hear it because it's barely moving. I'm like, no, that's already doing way too much. And that's another thing where it's like, to me, I see compression more as an effect send rather than an insert. And the more compressors we put on elements, the less loud we can eventually get the record. It's almost like a photograph that you keep screenshotting, whereby the resolution keeps going down. So you're starting to like work with less resolution versus no, does it really need that type of control, or can I just clip gain or automate these few little peaks or dips to make it more even and leave it at that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'm a big believer in that too, of clip gaining before you even get into the compression limiting. So then when you hit compression limiting, it's more consistent in what it's doing. And I noticed that too, that you do so much of your sweetening in parallel. Like it looks like on the track itself, to take the vocal, man, I haven't been asking all of these questions that the audience have been saying, so I want to get to it. But this is actually really related to one of the first questions I want to ask from the audience. So I'm going to ask their question and then weave mine into it. So Mullen is asking, would love to know what Koen's approach to vocal EQ is, how he decides what to subtract and what to add. And I'm going to just add on to that another similar question, because you were doing a lot of dynamic EQ on the vocal. And Marek Vusin asks, do you have any rule for timing that dynamic EQ? Are you just doing it by ear, or are there like best practices for setting up the dynamic EQ? So you can give us a little sense for the EQing that you're actually doing directly on the vocal. How do you decide what to do? How do you decide whether to use dynamic EQ and how fast, that kind of thing?
So for vocals, what I listen for in general is anything hurting my ears. So is anything in the mid high range that's just screaming at me, where I'm like, okay, this is going to create a headache for me because it's just not pleasant to listen to. And at the same time, when we move on to the lows, is there nothing more like the proximity effect that's too boomy, like too much out there, that causes this unnecessary like jumps in volume in that regard, where it's just muddying it up. And then the mid range for me is almost like a trying to say this correctly, with the resonance sound, it's almost almost want to say like when you're underwater, it's like this kind of fishbowl watery sound that's so apparent when you solo it. When you listen to the bands and you remove it, we instantly get a much clearer vocal. So it's literally what is hurting my vocal on the high and the mid highs that I need to tame. And then in the mid range, it's like, what is that almost like underwatery sound that just clutters that entire vocal? Whereby if I remove it, I get the clarity. And then on the low end, it's like, is there anything that just popping up that gives too much of a boom effect that will take away from the vocal as well? So that's why I listen to. And then dynamic EQ is more transparent in that regard, because we can really hone in on the frequency, or the slight frequency and the frequency surrounding it. And then as far as the timing goes, I usually want to get it as quickly as possible. So literally like snap and grab and pull that frequency down and release it almost as quickly as the frequency came in. So it's usually a fairly fast release. Now I always do it by ear, because you always got to listen and see how is this vocal reacting to the dynamic compression that I'm doing, the dynamic EQ at this instance. Is it sounding now squashed, like more of a squashed feel, which means I have it sustaining too long? Or is it too quick and it's not really doing anything? So you got to kind of find that sweet spot. And during mixing, it's a lot of times where I'm like, I think it's there, it's in the ballpark. Let me move on to the rest of the mix. And then later on, come back again and be like, okay, let me enable and disable to figure out what is really going on here. Do I like what it is? And then still playing around with attack and release to figure out like, okay, was that the good spot, or can I do a little bit more, a little bit less?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's very similar to how I end up using dynamic EQs in mastering, especially targeting vocals, where you're using it often very fast, a little bit like a de-esser, where you're just trying to get those things down. The one exception, I think, my use of dynamic EQs would be when mastering, when dealing with low-end instruments There are times where I want to dip down everything except for the transient of that low frequency instrument. So you're trying to bring down the resonance of that low frequency instrument, but not the transient, and kind of let that through. But on things like vocals, yeah, saying them really fast
True.
makes a lot of sense.
You could kill off the transients, and we all know the transient onsets of sounds is what really defines for our hearing what that
Sure.
sound is. If you
Yeah.
play the sustain, the ear has much more trouble figuring out what is this. But if it
Mhm.
hears the transient onset, then it's like, oh, that's a vocal. Oh, that's a percussion. Oh, that's a saxophone. Oh, that's a keyboard. So yeah, you're totally right. You can
Yeah.
completely kill off the audibility of a vocal with that too.
Mhm. Another question here from Studio 2105, who asks, are those stems or tracks, or is it a mix of both?
So it's all the audio are stems. They're
Mhm.
stemmed out from the original session. So a lot of times I have to combine the two. So for instance, I got a recording Pro Tool session from Mario,
Mhm.
which got prepped. My assistant prepped it and then loaded it into my final mix session because I don't want to figure out like where does this bus go to, where does this audio go to. Let's print it the way it is and load it in. So I only have to deal with the mix part of it. And then the beats usually get sent separate. So a lot of times I have to load in the rough that they recorded to with the beat stems and then rearrange the beat stems to make it exactly how the rough is that they worked with. So it's beat stems plus the vocal stems, and then as far as tracks goes, it's more like the parallel chains and the effect sends that are more like the auxiliary tracks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answer. Let me get through a couple more of the questions here that came in during the live stream before I switch over to the ones that are coming in now through the Q&A. Um, Dimitri Bountry asks, what's your process for tucking multiple layers of harmonies in the right spot under the lead vocal? Do you process layers separately, such as highs, lows, and mid backgrounds when processing large harmony sections? So your thoughts on, processing and getting to sit right background vocals that are often, very dense in the hip hop and R&B genres.
Okay, so there's two approaches with harmonies. I either get them sent as stereo pairs,
Hmm.
so the lows, the mids, and the highs that already be pre-mixed,
Hmm.
and they send it as a stereo pair because they're like, we like the way it sound. Don't mess around with the individual balances of that. This is the way we want it done.
Hmm.
Or I gotta get it in where they have it separated, and I pretty much leave them as is. The only thing that I would check for is, are any of the layers conflicting within each other, and at the same time, are any of the layers conflicting with the lead vocal? So are they getting in the way? Meaning a lot of times it's like figuring out, maybe I have to pan them wider to get more clarity from the lead vocal, or let me go and do some dynamic EQing with frequency spaces, which you could also do through a sidechain, which will get a little bit too advanced, but it could be in a point where you go like, I like the way they sound, and if I EQ them, if I statically EQ that frequency range out of it, now they become too thin or they sound slightly weird, but they only become a problem when the lead vocal plays. So if I sidechain them with the lead vocal and only have the compressor or the dynamic EQ respond to that frequency range when the vocal kicks in, then you get the masking effect again, where the ears don't hear that anything really got subtracted from the background vocal. So it sounds like the background vocals never changed the harmonies, and the lead vocal is crystal clear in between. So that's different approaches, but that it all varies and depends. But 9 out of 10 times, I just like to keep them the way they are, and then just figure out, are they problematic at any point in the song with whatever elements are there. But
Hmm. All right. Great answer. Here's another one moving around. Dr. Bolab asks, in simple terms, explain the difference between a parallel compressor versus a multiband compressor. I think that one's fairly easy. So Koen doesn't have to waste his time. A parallel compressor would just be a compressor that you're using to compress basically a duplicate of your track. And a multiband compressor is a compressor that you're using that has separate frequency bands, each of which can be compressed individually. So I hope that gives an overall idea of what they are. So I'd like to level up that question for you a little bit, Koen, and ask, what do you look for out of parallel compression versus multiband compression? How are you most likely to use those two separate different types of tools?
so my view on multi-band compression is, if I have to insert a multi-band compression on anything, that means I did something wrong mix-wise. So
Oh.
there's an imbalancement between my low, mids, and highs.
Hmm.
And I have to figure out where it went backwards, where I have to fix it. That's why
Mm.
I don't believe in multi-band. I know other people doing a great tool for other people.
Hmm.
My view is just like, as soon as I feel like I have to grab a multi-band compressor, I've done something wrong in the balance of the mix.
Right.
Parallel compression to me is more like an effect send, like you would use a
Hmm.
reverb, delay, chorus, flanger. So it's more like, okay, I want to affect the original sound without changing the sound of the original element. Because if I add 9 dB on a kick drum on itself, then the kick drum sounds completely different. Now, if I parallel compress it and add 9 dB afterwards, now you got this really low end sounding kick drum that gets blended in and lifts up the original kick drum without changing the overall sound of that original kick drum. So it's a creative tool of enhancing elements, lifting elements without changing the overall timbre sound of that element.
Right. And that reminds me of something I was starting to say that I noticed in your approach here and a lot of the elements is that you seem to be using inserts on individual tracks more to like solve problems, like you were talking about finding the things that bother you and bringing them down, and then you seem to be using parallel processing to really enhance things, as like a separate send. Like we have a good sound now to enhance it, rather than throwing a bunch of stuff on the track, let's send it out to our different sounding track and float some of that in. So that's something I noticed happening again and again there. I thought it was a cool approach and really sensible. All right, a couple more questions that came in during the live stream before we get to the ones that are coming through the Q&A right now. Hopefully this is a kind of quick one. Andres Quintero asks, compressor into the EQ or EQ into the compressor? Any idea about which way you should do it and why?
So my approach would be, unless the compressor has a sidechain function where I can roll off low end or high end, it could be that I'm like, for instance, on drums or something that contains low end material whereby I don't have to control the low end. That
Mm-hmm.
I can be like, okay, let me um, remove the low end. So let's say, I think an easier example is a vocal, for instance. So on the vocal, I don't need the low end, and I don't need the compressor to start reacting to that low end because I'm not going to use that low end. Meaning, let me roll off with an EQ the low end first, and then add a compressor afterwards, so that the compressor does not start overreacting on the low end bumps that we're not going to use anyway.
Right.
That's when I would use EQ before compression. So I would say filter, subtractive EQ before compression, additive color EQ after compression. I think
Mm,
that will be more of my vision on when to use EQ versus when to use compressor than EQ.
that makes a lot of sense. Here's one more from the live stream that I'm going to ask before getting into our Q&As, which is, this is a pretty open-ended one. Tobias Gebb asks, talk to me about layering bass with kick drum. I guess a more general version of that, how do you get bass and kick to sit together properly, is one of the most common questions in the world of hip hop and R&B and all mixing, to be honest. Country record, that's the biggest thing people ask. So what's your take?
So it depends. So sometimes you have a kick that sits slightly higher in frequency.
Mm-hmm.
So when the bass comes in, it kind of layers nicely.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have, which is 99% of the time, that the kick drum has the same low end frequencies as the bass. For instance, the 808 in predominantly the hip hop R&B records that I work with, is that the 808 and the kick play the same frequency. So, like I said, with the principle of masking,
Mm-hmm.
the way our ears work is, if a sound is louder than the other sound, then our ears are going to perceive the louder sound as the only sound existing. So with that being said, it makes much more sense to go and sidechain the kick to the bass, whereby the bass now, the 808, gets ducked with, let's say, between 3 and 6 dB. But the way I do it, like I showed in the example before, is, this is the only time I would use a multi-band
Mm-hmm.
out of everything, because I now can just say, okay, I want to only compress below 90 hertz. Because if I compress over the full range with the kick on the bass, now you can literally get that four on the floor feel of the pumping bass line. Versus now, only when the kick hits, I want the lower part of the bass to get ducked, so that the upper layer of that bass still sounds consistent in a way where our ears don't get tricked in hearing the pumping effect, but hear a clear kick come in and a clear bass. So that's how I would layer kick and bass in that example.
Great answer. That makes a lot of sense. Completely shifting gears here into the last of the questions from the live stream and now from the new Q&A we're doing here. So one of the first questions that came into this live Q&A was from the Producer's Edge, who asks, what was the experience, job, mindset, etc., that brought you from an audio student / novice to an audio professional? We have a couple questions like that. Will Newton asks, how do you recommend leveling up and accessing bigger labels and teams and creating new relationships? So that kind of centers your question, like what does it take and what was your path and what would you recommend to others who are trying to, cross over A, to professional, and B, for those who are A professionals, to level up and start working with more notable artists and labels and the like?
My advice would be kind of similar to what I did, is find the local studio spot and figure out whatever you can do there. Like, let me intern, I don't know, do you need a weekly person that takes out the trash or cleans the studio? I'll be there. I'll do it. I'll do it for free. You need somebody that makes coffee. I'll come in there every day and make coffee for you guys. Whatever needs to happen. But make sure it's at the local hotspot so that you get to meet the local talent, the local producers, build relationships with them. And before you know, they might take a liking to you, which makes everything easier, and just start offering your services for free. Like, let me just try me out. Let me do this for you, and let's see if you vibe with it or not. And if they do, then you're going to gain a long-term client out of that. And starting out locally with the hotspots means that you grow on a local level, which then gains attention from a regional level. From regional level, you now gain attention from a national level. From national, you go international. So it's literally a stepping stone from, let me just throw myself out there and just, take on as much as I can within reason, and let everybody, like, no, it's almost like, the kid in the candy store. It's like, okay, I'll give away free candy. Just take the candy, and if you like it, come back. That's the kind of the principle I would say to people to use. Like, okay, just start out locally with, whoever is hot in the local market and grow with them, because as they grow, you grow, and that way you can step further and further. More people take notice, and eventually people will start reaching out more to you because it's all word of mouth.
Yeah.
Then, you'll get to the bigger, plateaus within your career.
Sure. So what was your local hotspot and what was your next step after that spot?
I started out locally at a local radio station in the small town that I grew up in. Basically, in the weekend, just what they had me doing was taking out duplicates in their system. So it was literally going through the system every I think it was every Saturday morning, and okay, this song I already saw that over there, so let me delete it over here. And did that the whole time. But they also slowly taught me a lot about the equipment that they had in the studio, so I gained more experience from the equipment. And then at the same time, I was producing EDM music as a teenager. So I got my first publishing deal when I was about 14 years old. And that kind of reeled into the whole aspect of my publisher telling me, your mixes are terrible. You need to get those mixes on point, because else it's really difficult for us to place records.
Right.
So that experience kind of came into this whole OCD situation of, like, I need to figure out how to mix records. I don't know how to mix records. How do I do that? So that's how that whole started with, like, okay, let me do this thing at the local radio station. Then I started, trying to figure out, like, okay, what else can I do? There was a person that had a live PA company, but he was building a studio. So he's like, well, if you can just help me out every once in a while with events, basically as an assistant for our live guys, then once the studio is done, I'll promise you can kind of shadow the engineer that we have. So I went from there to getting into the studio over there and kind of shadowing the engineer that they had. And from there on, there was a new studio opening up in Rotterdam, and they were too ambitious, but they had the brand new Neve 88R when it came out. The studio was professionally done by, I think, Botau, if I say correctly, the New York company that did legendary studios. So I sent them a resume, and I basically told them, like, even if I have to work for free, I'll come down there and do it. So they're like, okay, just start out here. And through them, I started working with, because they were smart with marketing, because every single time there were US artists performing in Holland, they would, basically say, like, oh, you can record at our studio. So they come through, and at some point I met Jack Knight, Mario Winans. That's kind of how my international career slowly started off. Because through them, you get to meet Joel Santana. Lil Wayne was best friends with Joel Santana. So you can kind of see how that networking slowly but surely, like, turns into this, like, snowball that becomes.
Yeah. And I think we go into I remember the story. I think we go into even more detail. And you guys should check out, there's a podcast episode with me and Koen, where I think we can hear even more detail about his career progression, and then working with Dre and Timbaland, and what he learned from those guys as well. So definitely type in Sonic Scoop podcast, Koen Heldens, and you'll find a great interview there where we can go into even more detail on his career progression. There's so many great questions about this particular track and production, so I want to get into a few more of those. But always fun to hear ways that people made it happen. A couple questions about this track. Well, this is a more specific, just mixing in general question from G. Illish, who asks, what do you think of making two copies of bass and EQing them differently? Say one for low and one for mids, and maybe the last one that's stereo and high. So he's asking about the idea of doing things like splitting a bass track into multiple separate tracks that are just specific bands and processing them separately. Is that an approach you use at all?
Yeah, that's what I do with parallel, basically. That's my parallel approach. Like you saw on bass, where I parallel it, remove the low end, and only distort the high end.
Right.
Then for the kick, where I compress it and then put in a bunch of low end and remove a ton of high end. And then for the snare, almost similar, where I compress it, put in a little bit of low mids, some mids, and then remove a little bit of the highs, so you get more of like a boxy but in your face sound that blends in with it. So that's, and also with vocals, if it allows me to do it, I think it benefits, where I would compress it and then pull in a bunch of low end to lift that vocal out of it. So that's, I think, kind of similar approach as he was wondering about. But
Yeah.
I don't do it in multiple layers. I only do it in like one layer, where I'm like, okay, I'd like to add more low end to this, or I'd like to enhance and bring up more of the mid range.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So it's like a full band one, and then the additional band that needs to be processed done in parallel. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Moving on a little further, Moano asks, do you have any good tips on mindset when it comes to leveling drums or mixing drums? Do you have any specifics, like the kick should always be the loudest in the mix, or anything like that? Thanks for a great masterclass.
Depends. It's a good question. It depends all on the rough that I'm getting. Because sometimes, for instance, the rough has a lot of low end, almost to the point, well, literally to the point I'm like, it's too much low end.
Mm-hmm.
They like the low end, but at the same time, I know that this is not going to work well on other systems because there's just too much low end. So I'll trim the low end, and you get a better overall mix, and therefore also when it goes to mastering, a better overall master. I think the thing with that is that it takes a tremendous amount of years to kind of figure out your numbers. Because I always know that if I hit it with, for instance, -6 or -4 here, or -3 here, or minus half of a dB here, I know that it's coming out to be exactly on the numbers that I want to have. So it's almost like a trial and error for years that get you into that numbers game, where you know which numbers are kind of magic for you to hit in the way you're working. Other than that, it's like I said, I use the meter, like the WML meter, to double check how I'm hitting. And for instance, going into my master chain, I want to make sure I have about 1 to 3 dB of room, basically headroom, because I know that once I add in the parallel signals, that it's going to add to the loudness of the record, meaning that now I'm also starting to decrease my headroom, meaning that I'm about to run the mix too hot. So it's I always know, like, okay, -1 to -3 is kind of the hot spot to hit the SSL compressor in my case, because I know that that is going to turn into like almost 0 dB or close to 0 dB full scale. So
That's a great answer. So it sounds like metering the Moana's follow-up to this was asking about metering and whether that's an important part of it. And it looks like you do have some guidelines around that.
I think you can iterate that one too for mastering.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I think you can iterate further on that too in regards to mastering with metering as well.
Man, I could probably talk a little bit too long about this, but one question that comes in was Shelly Thomas wrote in while we were talking about how loud you mix. And Shelly was saying, I thought it's supposed to be -14 LUFS to be acceptable for streaming platforms. And the answer to that is pretty much no commercial releases that you listen to are mastered at -14 LUFS. And if you mastered at -14 LUFS, even after things go to automatic volume normalization, they will often sound quiet even after everything else gets turned down. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I mean, even if you had two loudest sections that were kind of evenly matched, a master that's mastered louder, the quieter sections will be louder and you'll get an overall impression of loudness, but it's also the tone of stuff. And man, some of the stuff you need to do to sounds to get them appropriately loud without sounding terrible makes them sound brighter, more articulate. One of the big things I think for actually getting a lot of kick drum into a final master is sometimes, at least at the mastering stage, to take out some of the low end. And often one of the things that stops records from getting appropriately loud and big sounding on bottom is that they have too much low end in places where the mixing engineer can't hear that low end. So helping to tighten some of that stuff up. And I see Koen nodding a whole lot here on this. And it's stuff
Oh,
that
it's
probably...
that's what it is. Because I've had a client that they liked how loud everything was. So they wanted a loud master, but then they didn't want to have the loud master because they wanted the kick drum to be extremely loud compared to the rest of the mix. So I explained them the same principle. I'm like, I cannot go this loud. Your whole kick drum is going to saturate so much that it's completely going to be depleted. It will implode.
Mhm.
And it's gone. I'm like, the only way to do this is let me turn down the kick drum, let me roll off a little bit of the low end, and then we can, run it in, and it will sound as loud as you want to have it, and it will still have that punch and hit the way you want to have it hit.
Yeah.
But they wanted to have that kick drum so loud, so we ended up at, I think I could only push it to like -9 long term on the lows.
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, that's just what it's going to be.
Yep, totally. And I just to piggyback on it for Shelly, I would say that how loud should the stuff be? Anywhere from like -13 would be a pretty quiet record to as loud as I would say -6 for like EDM and certain styles. If you do it really well, you can potentially push a record to like -5 or -4 and like have it kind of work. But then you need to make even more of these sacrifices we're talking about where, hey, if we want the kick really loud, the kick can not have it as much low end in it, but you'll still have the impression of having a really loud kick. But you have to make more sacrifices the louder you get. So I would say that for people at home, like it really depends on the genre. Like rock, you'd probably go anywhere from like -13 to -10, and -9 is really loud. But for hip hop or R&B, -9 is no longer really loud. -10, -9 is maybe the quieter end, and then like -7 is starting to get loud. And I'd say because of the low end that's in hip hop and R&B often, that one's right. Because of the low end that's often in hip hop and R&B, you can't push it as loud as EDM, which might have a little bit less low end. So, all things being equal, like that EDM record, maybe you can get to -6 or -5, and that hip hop record, maybe you can just get to -8 or -7, depending on how much low end they want in there. But this is all stuff that you've experienced a whole bunch, Koen, that the low end management is a big part of loudness. But enough of me yakking. This is about Koen. Why are you inviting me to answer questions? This is your live stream.
It's true. I would have answered it the same way because that's how it is.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep on going here. Some more good questions. Here's a question about working with XXX Tentacion from Connor Collister, who says, I noticed that XXX Tentacion is wanting to incorporate alpha, delta, beta frequency waves into a beat. How could this be done, as I haven't seen it done in the industry, and I believe it should be? So do you have any ideas around this? This isn't an area of big study for me, the whole binaural beats and like the frequencies of the universe and stuff.
Difference between the two sounds.
Right.
So everybody's always focused on like, oh, it says like, let's say 45 hertz or 4 hertz or anything. It's like, no, you have one sound, and within that sound, you have to create a shift so that there's like a slight difference between the left and the right side of that sound by, whatever the delta, alpha, omega tones that you want to create. Mm-hmm. So you could do that. And we were experimenting with that. We were experimenting with the chakra tones. We did a whole lot on the frequency level perspective of trying to figure things out of like, okay, and he would always call it the formula. So he'd call me on FaceTime and be like, let's talk about the formula. Let's dig in deeper, because he was studying it and I was studying it. And it was like always interesting to like figure out, and even tuning of the DAWs, like how do I tune it from 440 to 432? And, how do I tune the instruments to that, and we had conversation about that all the time. So it was still like a work in progress, but in essence, that's basically what you do. It's just one sound, but the left and the right have to be slightly in pitch different by the hertz that you want to create, whether it's like alpha, or beta or delta or the others.
Gotcha. All right. I'm sure we could do like a full video on this stuff, going into more detail, but I hope that helps you out for now. We're coming up on the end of our time here, but we do have some more questions. You have time for a few more questions, or do you have to bump off right now? Okay, we'll try to do like a lightning round here, where we get a few more in. Sophie Wynn says, I think what you did to this song is magical. She has a really open-ended question about, mixing R&B in general. We'll come back to that one just because I think that's so big and open-ended. Let me see if I can find a few more that are really more specific. BJ Kemp asks, do you ever use separate mix buses? Why or why not? And do you print your mixes or bounce them? That seems like a quick
I don't use separate buses. As you could see my session as well, there's no subgroups except for lead vocal or background vocals, because it makes more sense to actually group them, or if they really did a great job by combing the vocal to a point where I don't have to do it. The reason why I don't want to use subgroups is that it like I said, it's like that picture that you keep screenshotting. The resolution gets diminished. So if I send something to a subgroup, then the quality and the gain staging is now compromised. So that going into the mix bus, now I can't push it as loud as I would want it to. So that's why I don't use any of the subgrouping. If that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's go a little bit further here. Kingdom Swagger asks, Koen, when you do you ever replace drums in a mix? And if so, what's your favorite plugin to use for drum replacement?
Very, very, very rarely. I don't use a plugin for it because even with plugins, they are very, very accurate, but they're not as accurate. So I'd rather just go in and, for instance, do tap transient in Pro Tools. So I can easily just click on the track, tap, move it down, paste. Go to the next one, move it down, paste.
Are you still doing this yourself, or do you have a virtual mixing assistant of any kind?
No, we have an assistant for all of that.
you get a quarter of as many mixes done if you're doing still tapping to transient yourself.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's it happens very rarely, because it's every once in a while a record comes along where you're like, okay, that kick is just not hitting, but I do have a perfect kick for that in another session. So let's take that kick and throw it into the new one, or a snare where it's like it's slightly not there, but I know what you're going for, and you think I can do it mix wise with EQ and compression, but there's no way. It's just the sound that is there. The sample has to change. So it happens very rarely, but if it does, then that's the case. Instead of using plugins, I'd like it more accurate, because then that way I can make sure that the transients hit at the same time, so they're always in phase. Mm-hmm. Versus where you get that flanging sound where it kind of is or kind of not, or it kind of goes out of phase. So now you have like this out of phase sounding kick that has way less punch than it was supposed to have.
Yeah. And are you more likely to approach that as a sample enhancement or sample replacement?
Good question. I tend in that case to go for replacement.
Mm-hmm.
If I have to add it in there, then I probably could have solved it with, for instance, parallel compression. Because that means there was probably a lacking of a low end. So maybe on the low end, what you can do then is like use like a synthesis of Plugin Alliance, Subsynth, Submarine from Waves is another one, Lowrider from I forgot the company name. Those are great tools to add in there if indeed the kick is missing that low end, instead of layering another sample with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine that sample replacement is probably a little less common in especially high level hip hop and R&B, because these tracks, like before they even get selected by a singer, they're often just like they've been vetted and selected so much that a big part of the style is creating samples that sound great to begin with. Whereas, I mean, a rock mixer is much more likely to get some stuff and be like, hey, make this sound great. And sample replacement or enhancement is part of that. But I get making less sense, particularly in the genres and the levels that you're working with in those genres. Let's see, a couple more real quick. Simon Finks asks, I bought a keyboard workstation with 3,500 sounds. Is mixing a must? I feel like if it sounds good, it is good. If it sounds good, it is good. That is true. Is mixing a must? I mean, mixing is balancing many
Yes.
different sounds against one another. So if you want them well balanced, you're going to do some form of mixing, even if you're not hiring someone to do it. Let's ask some questions that are more specific for Koen here. Charles Roshabad asks, I can almost answer this one for you because I watched the presentation. Question, do you EQ every track or only vocals or just the master? And I think Koen's answer is going to be he doesn't EQ things that don't need EQ'd.
Exactly. It's almost the previous question that was said. If it
Yes.
sounds good, it is good. If it
Yeah.
feels good, it is good. If it's not causing a problem, then I'm probably going to take away from it. So just let's leave it the way it is, because it was intentionally done by the producer. So let's keep it the way it is. And if I feel like I need to enhance something, then let's just do parallel, because it's more like an effect that I add to it than subtract or add on the original source.
All right. Last couple questions here. A couple people are interested about learning about 432 hertz. Okay, last two questions, and we're going to let Koen go because he's been super generous, is giving us a little bit of extra time. The first of those two questions I'm going to ask is, I just had it. Hold on one second. Oh, I missed it. I think was it delete? Oh, here we go. How do you deal with a vocal that has too much proximity effect? Say something like someone recording really up close to a short SM7B. Are you more likely to use a low shelf or just going in to try to remove something between 300 or 700 hertz? So what's your approach to dealing with overly muddy vocals, let's say?
Yeah, so with the proximity effect, what you'll notice is if it hits at 50, it's going to hit at 100. It's going to hit at 200. It's going to hit at 400. So you have the slope up like an harmonic range. So you cannot go in and only say, I'm only going to remove, let's say, the 200, because it's still going to be below it and above it. So a shelf in that case is the best solution for it. Mm-hmm. And that's where parallel can come in really handy, because you can thin out the vocal by shelving out that whole frequency buildup from the low end to like the low mids and clean those up. Now your vocal sounds less thick, so to speak, less body. But that's when the parallel will come in handy, because now with the parallel, I can bring in a lot of that low end again and balance it out against the original sound. So now that I have a very static, solid vocal that not only is not just thin, now I added the body back in without having that buildup of the proximity effect. So that's how I would approach the proximity effects. So I would roll off the low end up until probably can get away about 150 hertz and below, just roll it off with a high cut filter, and then shelve the next band, just shelve everything, find a spot, and anything below 500 or 400 or 300, and I use the parallel to kind of compensate for that and bring it back in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, last one, and this is a good one because we're coming around full circle. This is from Under Boogie Funk, who says, "Hi, Koen and Justin. Thanks for doing this. Do you often refresh your ears with reference tracks? And when you were getting used to your headphones, is that something you did a lot of? And how often do you update your reference tracks? Thanks and cheers." Any thoughts on that? Using reference tracks, getting to know your monitoring, and potentially using them during a mix session or during the day?
So what I do is every Friday, when New Music Friday comes out for Spotify, I start listening to a select few of the releases. And at the same time, I always listen to the top 50 on Spotify. And then I can kind of gauge like what is the sound that people are gearing towards as far as the consumer end go. So it's on a weekly basis in that regard. And then ear refreshing in general, I do it every 20 minutes for 5 minutes, every hour for 10 minutes, and then every 4 hours for at least an hour. So I always have fresh ears coming back in and out, because you realize—
You're talking about taking an ear break, not listening to references, but totally stopping listening.
The only reference I really use during mixing is the rough mix that they present me with. Right. And then still I maybe, my half break time, I might take out 5 minutes to kind of compare it to what is on the charts now, to kind of see like, okay, this can work. But a lot of times, especially working with Triple X, what we had with that was you just wanted to sound completely different. So there's no reference to be put against it. It was just like, okay, we either go for a more poppy feel, but even that's going to be slightly different than the pop record you hear, or we're going to go for a more lo-fi feel, which is going to make me sound like a terrible mixer, but it's like you have to adapt to that of like, okay, let's make this just sound good but terrible good.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And I would encourage people to think of a similar approach. Like you shouldn't, as big of an advocate as I am for referencing to get to know your system, you shouldn't constantly be referencing against other records when you're mixing. You just start chasing like, oh, my snare isn't as loud as their snare, should be as loud as their snare. But what that snare over there, and it's just
Yeah, or the
really
snare
weird.
doesn't sound exactly like their snare. It's like,
Yes.
no, it's like it's the samples that they've picked or the tracks that you've been given to mix with
Yeah.
could be completely different than what you're hearing. So it's comparing apples with oranges.
Yeah.
It's just totally two different things.
The one caveat I would offer is that in mastering, I do use references more extensively than you might in mixing. And not every mastering engineer does, but since I don't have the luxury of often having the client in the session with me and it's going to be the final thing, I'll ask for a bunch of records they love the sound of. And before I get started on their session, I'll listen to hopefully at least 3 records that they love the sound of just to kind of acclimate my ears and say, okay, all these records sound different, but here's the bassiest one. If I go bassier than this, I'm probably doing it wrong. Here's the brightest one. If I go brighter than this one, I'm probably doing it wrong. And when I'm doing that first track, I might really quickly listen between the track I'm mastering for them next to all of these 3 to make sure it just feels like it deserves to sit on the shelf. And, I'm not necessarily trying to mimic any one of them. I'm taking general cues, and getting 3 different things lets me kind of triangulate in where I'm not trying to get married to any one of them and copy it, but it gives me a rough idea. And then once that first song is mastered, then the reference that I'm using is the mastered track for the rest of the album. And that's the only thing I'll reference again, just to make sure I'm not too far off, that I'm 3 hours into the session. Am I pushing everything too dark or too bright compared to what we had established? And so I think referencing, you have to use it a little bit more in mastering, but hopefully just by listening to music all the time, like you're doing in your studio, that you get in tune to your environment, so you don't have to do constant EBs or anything like
But
that.
you're right too, because it's if you're doing a bigger project where it's going to be an EP or an album. First thing I always say is this is the single, so whatever this is going to sound like is exactly what everything else is going to sound like.
Right.
There's no turning back from this. If
Yeah.
this is the sound that's going to be, then everything else is going to sound like this. So let's make sure we work on this sonically to the point where you're completely satisfied.
Yeah.
Then I have a blueprint for myself, knowing, okay, I know what the other records need to sound like. So that's an internal referencing point as well.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a good full circle here, because we took it back to monitoring, getting to know your stuff. So big shout out and thanks to Sonarworks again for sponsoring this one, making it free to the public. Check out their stuff at sonarworks.com. Sound ID Reference is the latest version of their solution. Koen uses it on his headphones on every single mix that he does. He used it in his studio on his monitors for the longest time. I'm a big believer in it. Everyone who's reviewed it on Sonic Scoop, the reference solution, has absolutely loved it. And if you are mixing, particularly on a budget, absolutely does wonders. But even if you have room treatment and stuff, I would say that once you spend $1,000 or $2,000 on room treatment, spending another $300 or $400 isn't necessarily going to make the hugest difference compared to potentially spending $300 or $400 on something like Sonarworks. You can start to correct some issues that would cost a lot more to try to fix with custom solutions, architectural solutions, bass trapping and stuff like that. So if you're just doing broadband panels in a room, I really recommend their EQ for that stuff as well. So big thanks to those guys. Big thanks to Koen. You went above and beyond overtime. I apologize for keeping you so long, but there were just so many great questions for you. Really appreciate your time there in Miami, Florida. Now, before we let you go, what are the best places for people to follow you, find out more about what you're up to, that kind of thing? Where should people try to keep in touch?
Instagram is the simplest thing ever. It's the only thing I have.
Yeah, all right.
Instagram at mixed by Koen Heldens. That's it.
Got
and then
it.
through there, you automatically can also in the bio click on my website, but that's pretty much the happening place.
Sweet. Last quick notes for you guys. If you want to get some free stuff, we have the MixCon mega giveaway. It's going on at sonicscoop.com/MixCon giveaway. That's sonicscoop.com/MixCon giveaway, where you can enter to win thousands of dollars worth of free gear. We got more MixCon presentations coming up every week for the next few weeks. Go to mix-con.com. That's mix-con.com, or follow the MixCon Facebook page to get alerted by all of those, or go to the Sonic Scoop newsletter, and we'll send more information as those things come along. All right. Thanks again, Koen Heldens. It was wonderful to have you here. You did awesome. It was absolute treat to see the way you work and look into a real session. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time. All right, and I've just ended the stream. Thanks, Koen. You did great. I really appreciate